Welcome to the IOPA session at the ICCR Fall Conference. We're glad you all are joining us. We'll start the session in about 1 minute. We'll go over a few house rules in just a moment here. I see people are still entering the session, so welcome to everyone. Okay, I think on my computer at least, the magic hour has arrived. And so we will get started here with a few house tips, I guess they're called. I was going to call them rules, but tips does sound better. This is Donna Meyer. I'm with Mercy Investment Services, and I wish to welcome you to the IOPA session. We're delighted that you're joining us. These conference tips, I think most of you have learned the rhythm, if you will, of the virtual ICCR conference. So you probably have it down pat, but just in case, if you have any connectivity issues, send them to Victoria, and her email address is on this list as the first issue. This session will be recorded, so you'll be able to get a copy of the recording as well as copies of the slides we'll be showing. They suggest that on the Zoom that you use a speaker view rather than gallery view because you'll be able to see the slides better. There are no breakout rooms for this session, so everyone will be together in one session. And we do ask that if you have any comments or questions as we move along, since this is virtual, please use the chat box. Just send your question, and when we finish, our fearless leader, Meredith Miller, will field the questions, and if we don't get to all the questions, we will have a follow-up to you. We'll send either an email or we'll call you with a follow-up so you can be sure that all your questions and comments will get answered. Again, thank you for those who are just joining. I'm Donna Meyer, and I really welcome you. I feel like you're all friends, only we're kind of far apart right now. So, John, do you want to go to the second slide? And we'll get started with this session. Many of you, I've been watching your names here who are attending today, have attended past IOA and then IOPA sessions at the ICCR conferences. So you will remember that we all started out as the IOA, the Investors for Opioid Accountability. And in the beginning, our work was around the opioid epidemic and really focused on the US. We quickly realized that the epidemic was spreading to other parts of the world, and so we broadened our focus to other countries. Also, you'll see that in the beginning, we focused on manufacturers of opioids and distributors of opioids, but we quickly expanded to retailers So we had the whole supply chain addressed. Our work on opioids was focused on opioids for the 18 and 19 proxy season. And then in the 20 proxy season that we just finished a few months ago, we added other pharmaceutical issues. And you may wonder why we added other pharmaceutical issues. I think the main reason was because we had a really, really solid, strong coalition of investors, 61 members of the organization with like 4.3 trillion in assets under management. So we thought that we could bring a little bit of boost to the ICCR work in pharmaceutical. We try to coordinate carefully with ICCR, and we tend to focus on more of the governance and oversight issues, and ICCR tends to focus more on the access issues and the pricing issues. But we're members of both groups, and we try to coordinate very carefully. We try to encourage IOPA members to join ICCR, and we encourage ICCR members to join the IOPA. So I don't want you to think of us as two separate organizations, but rather two coordinating organizations. As we expanded into pharmaceutical business practices, you see in that sidebar, it is the cost of company settlements for 10 years, which are rather substantial, especially for those of us that aren't used to counting our pennies in billions of dollars. And pharmaceutical companies tend to think that that's an ordinary cost of doing business. We want them to look at the financial risks involved in these settlements, as well as the reputational risks that they endure from routinely settling on all these cases. We added generic and insulin manufacturers and the price fixing practices that they've been accused of. We added for other companies anti-competitive practices and other business risks. And like I said before, we mostly focus on governance and oversight practices through the IOPA. John, do you want to go to slide 3? So today we are very lucky that we have a team of IOPA experts here with us today. Each of these colleagues will tell you about the work stream that they are leading. And so they'll tell you about what we've done as well as what our plans are for 2021. I'm going to be rather unconventional or unique, I guess, in that I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves when they take over the slide deck. So if you want to go to slide 4, John, we'll start with our opioid work, since that's a long-running work. 2021 will be our 4th year in working with opioid companies. The major proposal for opioid companies was for board-level oversight of the opioid business risks. We want to know how their board is managing the risks, significant risks, may I say, related to the opioid business. We've universally had the SEC rule in our favor when this proposal has been challenged. Most of the proposals in the last 3 years have received a majority vote, and so many of the companies have recently decided to just settle with us rather than allow the proposal to go to a vote. But in 2020, J&J let their proposal go to a vote, and we received 61%. Which is very significant. And so they have promised to report later this year. In fact, we just got word yesterday that they've got a draft ready for us to look at. Walmart settled and we withdrew. They promised to report by the end of October, and I guess it's about time to be checking in with them. We now have approached 15 companies. All of them either produce reports or they're promising reports, and we still need to work on them. So do you want to go to slide 5, John? Yes, unfortunately, the opioid epidemic is continuing. The COVID epidemic kind of has overshadowed, I guess is the right word, the opioid epidemic, which is unfortunate because we think the death rate is actually climbing. But if we go back, we had 4 times the number of deaths from opioids in 2018 than we did 20 years earlier. We were so pleased in 2018, the last year for which we've got official figures, that there was a slight decrease in opioid deaths. We thought it was something to celebrate. Unfortunately, the 2019 data is not yet finalized, which is unusual, but I'm sure the statisticians are working on COVID instead of opioids. And so we'll see when the final data comes out, but it looks like the deaths may have swung up again. That's preliminary data. The National Institute for Drug Addiction reports that about 128 people die every day from opioids, and real-time tracking, which is not official, shows that there is actually an increase in overdoses during the COVID pandemic. We think that increase may be due to street drugs, but you've got to remember that street drugs, 80% of street users first use prescription drugs. NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, you can look them up on the website, or I can send you a link. Someone's asked that question. We as investors do not have a handle on street drugs or on the sales, those that are selling street drugs for obvious reasons. I don't think they're listed on the stock exchanges. That's supposed to be a joke. But we do focus on prescription drugs, which are the underlying cause of street drug use. So on slide 6, this is our work plan for 2021. We've got a couple companies at which we need to finish the reports. We've got a couple which we're working on their first reports that will need a bit of help and effort to get those finished. And then we've got some new companies. Most of the new companies are because of mergers or changes in ownership, and we need to be sure that they've got opioid oversight practices in place. The one company that may surprise you is Facebook, and Facebook's been accused of actually selling opioids online. We hope they've got that fixed, but we will be discussing that with them. And then we intend to monitor all 15 companies. If any of you in this session would like to get involved with opioids, please do contact us and we'll try to connect you with the best option for you. And I will, Brianna, turn this over if you want to go to slide 7. Tejal will be talking about independent chair, and she will introduce herself.
Thanks, Donna. Hi, everyone. My name is Tejal Patel. I'm the Corporate Governance Director for the CTW Investment Group. We've been working closely with Meredith and Donna and the rest of the IOPA since its inception in 2017. Thank you guys all again for inviting me to present on the IOPA's Independent Chair Proposal Initiative. So one of the focuses this year for the IOPA is increasing support levels for the independent chair proposal as it relates to the IOPA's focus list. The proposal, as most of you know, requests that the board develop a policy that requires that the chairman position be filled by an independent director. This is an important distinction, I think, from the separation of CEO and chair proposals, because for those proposals, you can still have a non-independent director in the chairman position. And we really want to prevent the inherent conflict that there is between someone who is part of the management team then overseeing the management team itself. So why do we need an independent chair at these companies? Companies often cite synergies between the two positions, but in reality, they're very different. So CEOs are in charge of the day-to-day management of the company, executing strategy and driving performance. Chairs oversee the management's execution of strategy and performance, but they also focus on much more high-level issues. Most importantly, they should act constructively to challenge executive directors and kind of balance shareholders' long-term interests. Another thing that we hear often is that there's a lead independent director that's in place who's got pretty robust responsibilities sufficient to counterbalance the combination. LIEDs are important, but they have a very different role and skill set. So while they often have many responsibilities, they're just an alternative means of communication for board members and stakeholders. Ultimately, they don't lead the board itself. So we believe basically that the particular risks in the pharmaceutical industry especially warrant a separation of CEO and chair, which would allow for a more objective oversight of management and better balances the decision-making and fulfillment of fiduciary duties to shareholders. So as you can see from the slide that's up here, we've made some pretty significant progress on the independent chair proposals. 3 of the proposals reached 40% or above in terms of support levels from independent shareholders in 2020. You'll see on the next slide, actually, that we also had 3 distributors that settled the proposals in prior years. Oh, you can go back, John, sorry. So keeping in mind that the independent chair proposal in particular is usually heavily scrutinized, I think the IOPA has fared pretty well in this space, especially considering that the average support levels for these proposals in 2020 jumped up 36% to 36%. This past season. In 2019, they were about 28%. So you can see we're actually above the average. So in every one of the cases that's listed in this chart, but J&J and Facebook, the concern that we found with the issuer was that they were engaged in anti-competitive practices, but particularly drug pricing issues. And in the case of J&J, that company had litigation concerns related to its opioids business line, but also related to some product liability issues with its talc-based products as well. Facebook, as Donna mentioned, was a little bit more unusual. There was a whistleblower complaint that was filed back in May alleging that Facebook had failed to stop illicit drug transactions on its platform, which included the sale of opioids. Given this governance failure on top of the kind of myriad of other governance failures at the company, including election interference, hate speech issues, et cetera, the Illinois Treasurer has filed a proposal there in an effort to enhance the company's board leadership structure. So we've reviewed our strategy and plan to refile at a more targeted list of companies where we believe we're going to have greater success of passage of the proposal. And so we're going to be refiling at J&J, Eli Lilly, Bristol Myers, Gilead, AbbVie, and then Facebook in 2021. Could you go to the next slide? Thanks. So as part of our analysis of the prior year's shareholder proposals, we really tried to determine what the drivers were for a successful independent chair proposal, which included an analysis of the proxy advisors' policies and also major asset managers' policies. In terms of the proxy advisors, Glass Lewis largely supports independent chair proposals. Usually they have about average support at 85%. They did support all of the IOPA's independent chair proposals last year. ISS has a slightly lower support rate. It's at about 70%. So we really tried to break down what was most persuasive under ISS's model. And I should also add that many asset managers also look at a very similar list of criteria at ISS. So it's worth delving into the factors that are used very briefly. ISS doesn't use a principles-based approach, though they are generally for the proposal according to the policy. So effectively, the policy looks at the scope of the proposal, the current board leadership structure. So that's looking at kind of, is there a lead independent director? Are they elected by the independent directors? What's the overall board independence? Things like that. Problematic governance structures, performance of the company obviously is important. And then they've got a catch-all called other factors. So that's things like evidence that the board failed to oversee and address a material risk, or evidence that the board failed to intervene when management's interests were contrary in some way to shareholders' interests. So what we saw was that companies really latched onto these factors in their opposition statements. They almost mechanically kind of hit each one of these in their defense of why the combination works for them. And what we determined in our analysis and conversations with ISS was that no single factor is dispositive. So unlike a lot of other proposals that can kind of translate easily and require little customization, the analysis for an independent chair proposal is very company specific. It relies very heavily on our ability to demonstrate the economic and financial impact on shareholders of the company. And oftentimes these come in the form of fines or penalties, expenditures related to enhanced compliance programs, or reputational damage to the extent we can sort of somewhat accurately calculate that. It's also about demonstrating losses that have occurred or that are highly likely to occur. So if, for example, you are involved in a massive multi-district litigation, it's highly likely that there's going to be some kind of penalty compared to if you just have one lawsuit by a state AG, for example. So our exempt solicitations are going to be very, very focused on those elements and articulating kind of the regulatory and legal risks that demonstrate why separation is necessary. And so we're going to be filing at the 6 companies that I mentioned. And that's all that I've got right now. If we could advance to the next slide so I can pass it to Mark, but I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Mark Hill. I'm the Senior Corporate Governance Analyst for the UAW Retiree Medical Benefits Trust. Happy to be back and presenting today for what is now my 3rd ICCR conference. Today we'll be discussing the incentive deferral initiative being conducted by ICCR and IOPA members. We started this initiative about a year ago and were able to get over a dozen pharmaceutical companies to come to the table and agree to join a working group to negotiate the development of a set of principles for a policy to defer a portion of compensation. The companies that are participating in this working group are not just opioid companies, but other drug manufacturers, distributors, and retail pharmacies who have faced accusations of price fixing and deceptive marketing. Now, by way of background and to provide some context here, ICCR and IOPA members have negotiated clawback policies at over 18 pharmaceutical companies over the past 3 years. And the clawback policies allow a company to recoup compensation that has been paid out to a covered employee in the event of some misconduct. However, as the fallout of the opioid crisis and other regulatory penalties have been handed down, we weren't really seeing many pharma sector companies using their clawback policies. So we held discussions with them and basically asked them, why is this, are these clawback policies not being used? And in a roundabout way, we kind of came to the conclusion that many companies weren't using their clawback policies because it would be extremely difficult for them to claw back that compensation that had already been paid to the employees and would almost certainly lead to costly litigation for the company. And so again, we just saw a lot of non-use of those clawback policies. Additionally, we saw in the wake of the global financial crisis, as part of Dodd-Frank, the financial institutions and banking companies were required to adopt some sort of deferral for their bonus policies. And so between that and some companies in the EU who are becoming mandated to adopt some sort of bonus deferral, we thought that this would be a really good tool to take to the pharma sector companies here in the US. And in fact, we spoke with a lot of the European pharma-based companies who were mandated to adopt those bonus deferral policies, and they were helpful in describing some of the advantages and some of the hurdles that they face in adopting a deferral policy. In fact, one company stayed on to be part of the negotiation in the working group and was able to serve as a resource to both the investors and the companies as we negotiated those principles. So kind of taking all of that information in, IOPA members deduced that a policy to defer compensation would allow these companies to retain control over a defined amount of compensation for a period of time. And in the event of some misconduct or late arriving information that a covered employee engaged in some sort of misconduct, the company would be able to recoup that deferred compensation to avoid some of the issues that the clawback policy presented, such as the costly litigation, because this compensation is still under the company's control during this time. So kind of in short, what a compensation deferral policy does is it takes a portion of an employee's compensation and defers it over a period of time. So if like a named executive officer receives like an annual bonus received in cash at the end of every year, that deferral policy would defer that cash bonus for, let's say, 3 years. So if they receive a 2019 annual bonus at the end of that year, the deferral would make it so they wouldn't receive that bonus until the end of 2021 or 2022, depending on the period. And the company would retain control for that period of time. And if there was some sort of misconduct, the company could recoup that compensation. So again, we were able to convene these 14 companies in a working group to negotiate some principles for a deferral policy that they would then take to their compensation committees and recommend it for adoption. The working group was facilitated by Charles Elson of the University of Delaware's Corporate Governance Center and Doug Chaw, who is former general counsel of Johnson & Johnson. The process was obviously a little different than we usually take for the traditional 14A8 process with filing a resolution. The investors who partook in this working group agreed to not file a bonus deferral resolution for one cycle. And the companies who agreed to participate in this working group agreed to participate in good faith, and that they would be engaged and consider sending the final agreed upon principles to their compensation committees for approval. So through negotiations with these companies, we settled on the set of principles that you see on the slide here. You'll notice that the main points of the principles are that the expanded deferral policy includes a deferring a portion of not only that short-term bonus, but also a long-term equity incentive deferral, which kind of came out of the negotiations with the companies and the investors as we worked through the working group. Additionally, it does allow the companies to reduce compensation in the deferral period based on late arriving information. So if it wasn't a recoupment of that full deferred compensation, they can reduce that amount in the interim period as well for any sort of information that kind of comes up during that time. John, if you could move to the next slide. So moving on to this slide here, the IOPA investors and the companies have agreed upon a final set of principles, and we are now waiting to hear back from the companies on whether they will take these principles to their compensation committees for final approval. We should know by November whether they do adopt the principles that we've agreed on, and we've sent them a press statement that they're also taking to look at approval for that as well. So last year, we filed this resolution at 4 companies that didn't agree to partake in the working group, which included Eli Lilly, Johnson & Johnson, Walmart, and AmerisourceBergen. We were no action at J&J and Walmart, and we have amended that resolution for this season, hopefully surviving any challenges at the SEC. But we will again be filing this resolution at those 4 companies that didn't partake in the company, and any of the companies that are in the working group but don't take those final principles up to their compensation committees to adopt that bonus deferral policy. And actually, we've with the filing deadlines, we've actually filed the resolution already at ABC and Walgreens. John, can you move to the next slide? So here on this slide, you can see the text of the resolution. You'll notice that the resolution itself is focused on just that short-term bonus deferral rather than the long-term equity deferral that the principals discussed that kind of came out of the negotiations. That's to survive at the SEC, and also, we felt that focusing on that bonus deferral was, really what we were aiming at when we started the working group. And so we're going to remain focused on that in this cycle. And again, it was no action at Johnson & Johnson and Walmart last season. So we're hoping that, this amended deferral resolution will survive at the SEC. So kind of in short, again, to summarize, we're waiting to hear back from the companies that participated in this working group. And hopefully they'll take it to their compensation committee and they'll adopt, and, that will be, we won't need to file, but if so, we will seek people to file at those companies that don't adopt those principles. And this effort has really been a lot of work. I said it's been about a year now. There's been about 7 long meetings and a lot of behind the scenes work. So we're excited to see where this resolution goes forward. So I know I've covered a lot of information, but we do believe this policy adoption would just be another tool in our suite of compensation reforms that we can use to deter and curb some of the behavior that we've seen in the sector. And so, if you have any questions and want to get involved at all, please go ahead and put them in the chat box and we'll cover those at the end. And I think I'm at my time here, so I'll hand it over to Michael Price-Jones with the Teamsters, who's going to discuss the IOPA's COVID response initiative. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I just wanted to say that it's a pleasure for the Teamsters to be presenting at ICCR here. John, rather, here we go. I think a lot of people have been thinking about this issue, and certainly I know in ICCR, but also elsewhere. So I just want to contribute to that debate. There obviously isn't one fast or one set way of dealing with this. So take these suggestions as you will. But I think these headlines provide some useful context to understanding what we're up against. I think at this point, we shouldn't be concerned only with the scope of a company's COVID policies, but how they're actually being implemented, how they're interacting with the company's existing culture, their ethics, and even their compensation. And I think, this isn't just coming from the teams, as I think a lot of people on this call would agree, but at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say that your COVID policy is only as good as your employee relations. And I think some of these headlines prove that. Now, if we skip to slide 14 a moment, I just wanted to go over, obviously people are focusing on many sectors, but there is something unique about focusing on the drug retailers and distributors with respect to COVID. And I think first off, the drug distributors are like Amazon. They're huge, they run huge distribution centers with workers packed in. So when we think of the COVID risk at Amazon, we should be extending that to the likes of McKesson, ABC, and Cardinal. On top of that, again, like Amazon, there are vast transportation networks, and they potentially bring exposure to vulnerable populations, not just your retail stores like CVS and Rite Aid, but to your nursing homes and your hospitals treating people for COVID. And as an aside, and this was really scary, but we did an analysis for a transportation company, we being the Teamsters, where we mapped the potential exposure from having just one infected driver continue his or her normal routes. And the results are literally horrifying. The virus would spread from community to community. And that works as an analogy for what we'd also be seeing at the likes of McKesson and Cardinal and AmerisourceBergen. Again, I think we need to realize that these are some of the largest companies in the country. CVS employs over 300,000 workers. So if we want to get at workers' exposure to COVID, going after the drug distributors and retailers is a valid effort there. Obviously, we're dealing with potentially the most essential business of all essential businesses during the pandemic. In fact, we're going to rely exclusively on McKesson for the delivery of the vaccine. How McKesson got an exclusive contract with the government, I'm not entirely sure, given the fact that ABC and Cardinal could obviously provide useful services there as well. They're also extremely low margin businesses. That's why the likes of McKesson and Cardinal have some of the biggest revenues in the country, but they rarely show up on the top 20 in terms of market capitalization. And that makes it very difficult for them to absorb the costs and the efficiency declines that COVID and COVID safety protocols will necessitate. So it requires us to be especially vigilant there. And finally, I think as everybody on this call knows, this is an industry that has gone things wrong time and time again. Just look at the opioid crisis. We've seen warped cultures, distorted incentives, and a history of inadequate oversight failures, particularly when it comes to internal controls. So for an industry that compliance is the very core of their business, they are notoriously bad at it. And I think at the end of the day, COVID is a compliance issue. Now, if we just go back to slide 13, John. Along with a number of other groups, we did a kind of round one of this initiative in the spring, which was focused on the content of companies' COVID policies and their disclosures, and essentially trying to push them to, look after workers with 14-day sick pay and other kind of protocols. And if we just jump to the slide 16, John, what we've gleaned is, and I don't mean to undermine any of those initiatives, but companies have been very cagey. We've actually learned very little. The disclosures which first came out in the spring haven't been updated. And if you look across particular sectors, they're very uneven in what they're actually disclosing and what kind of policies and practices they have in place to protect their workers. And specifically, what we don't know is how social distancing procedures are being designed, adapted, and enforced for particular operations. The decision process for opening and closing facilities. We don't know when they're happening and why they're happening in certain places and not in others. We're not sure how the costs of PPE or facility closures, or even the safety-related productivity declines we're necessarily seeing, are being factored into the company's performance objectives and compensation levels. We know a lot of CEOs and senior executives are seeing their bonuses adjusted for a lower growth environment, but how is that happening throughout the organization? And one thing we're particularly concerned about is incentives at maybe the regional or even the local manager level. How are they incentivized to potentially look after their workers through closures of the facilities, or keep them open because they necessarily need to ensure their performance reviews or their compensation are as good as they can be? I think the Wall Street Journal did a very good article on this, which is the differences between companies in how they're alerting their workers to COVID infections. And a lot of companies are hiding behind HIPAA on this and exposing other workers to a potential infection. There was a great piece in Bloomberg about gag orders. And we've seen this in some of the Teamster industries where workers are being told that they can't speak to the media, when on this issue, the media is being really one of the most primary defenses workers have against dangerous circumstances. And also, we need to see whether they have robust whistleblower protections in place. And finally, we need to consider what kind of termination and disciplinary procedures there are. And this might seem a bit of a tangent, but I wonder if folks have seen the article, I think it was covered in numerous outlets, of a Rite Aid worker in New York who was fired for defending herself against a maskless customer who went on a rampage after being asked to put a mask on. And then also we had the example at Amazon earlier in the year where workers leading the protests over working conditions were terminated for purportedly violating social distance rules. So if you have a bad work environment, can COVID policies unfortunately be a way of getting rid of problematic or troublesome employees? So John, if we jump to the next slide. In short, we don't know how policies are being implemented. We don't know how they're being assessed for their performance and effectiveness. We don't know what key performance metrics are being reported up to the board. And specifically, we don't know how they're interacting with company-wide performance objectives, compensation structures, and culture. We had a conversation with one company and we raised the issue, and this was part of the IOPA, we raised the issue of whether there could be distorted incentives at the regional level not to close facilities when there had been an outbreak. And we were told that that would just be impossible to comprehend at the company because they had such a great corporate culture. And I think throwing corporate culture in there is the last straw a company has when they don't have any other defense to whether something could be distorted in the way management are responding to a safety issue. So if we go to the next slide, John. We don't have any proposals at this point. We're trying to work on proposals, but we are having an engagement effort at the three big drug distributors, Amerisource, Cardinal, and McKesson, and the three big drug retailers, CVS, Rite Aid, and Walgreens, and the other big pharmaceutical retailer, which would be Walmart. And first of all, we're asking for a root and branch review of compensation and benefit structures to ensure they're not encouraging excessive risk-taking with respect to COVID. We're absolutely concerned about whether there could be an outbreak at a particular facility, but the compensation structure at some point in that organization could guard against doing the right thing, which would be closing the facility, or social distancing is necessarily reducing the efficiency and productivity of operations. Our objectives and compensation for the key individuals being changed appropriately so they're not trying to work against good safety processes. And second, we're calling for an internal audit of the implementation of occupational health and safety controls that have been established to minimize the exposure. This would be asking them to do a on-the-ground review based on our sampling size of working out what they're doing actually on the ground and how they're intersecting with corporate culture, employee relationships, and also asking employees to report upwards on what they think the implementation has been so far. And so just to give you a quick sense of what we're getting at here, maybe some of you guys saw this, but CVS, Business Insider reported that CVS employees, and they found numerous examples of this, they were instructed, and this was in August, so we're not talking in March where it could be forgivable perhaps, but CVS employees were instructed to go to work even after they'd been exposed to COVID. Now, this isn't company policy, but it was happening at the regional level because regional managers were either under pressure to prove their worth to the company or incentivized perversely. It was also reported that CVS district leader in Georgia had instructed employees not to call customers who had picked up prescriptions from a pharmacist who subsequently tested positive, again in violation of CVS policies. And there's a great resource here, it's rather sad looking at it, but OSHA complaints. We've seen numerous examples where even corporate policies are not being followed and enforced in August, in September, and July, with social distancing not being facilitated, exposed employees not being allowed to go home and being forced to work, even symptomatic employees being forced to remain at work, mask wearing is not being enforced either by customers or employees. And finally, there's an absolute lack of cleaning and sterilization. So again, companies can have the best policies on paper, but how they're being implemented. And we aren't in a perfect world here. We're in a world where there's corporate culture, competing incentives, and there can be also other objectives getting in the way of implementing COVID. And we want to know how those are all interacting to protect workers. With that, I did want to pass this over to Beth.
I think we need the next slide. Great. So I'm Beth Young. I am a lawyer who has focused on shareholder initiatives and corporate governance for over 20 years. And I want to just talk very briefly about a couple of new headwinds in the proposal process due to recent regulatory initiatives. I'll take the one first that has already been adopted, the changes to Rule 14A, the shareholder proposal rule. As many of you know, both the ownership and resubmission thresholds have been raised starting in the 2022 proxy season. For the IOPA's work, the resubmission threshold is probably more significant. You now need 5% voting support if a proposal on substantially the same subject matter has been voted on in the past 5 calendar years, 15% if it has been voted on twice in the past 5 calendar years, and 25% if it has been voted on 3 or more times. So that has a couple of implications for our work. The first is that new proposals will face more pressure right out of the gate. And that gives us a bit of a greater incentive to engage companies on new issues outside the proposal context before going to a proposal strategy. The second is that the way that the SEC staff decides if something is on substantially the same subject matter is somewhat arbitrary, and they have the SEC staff has a lot of discretion in applying that standard. So that also can affect us in that if we are asking for a reform or addressing an issue through one kind of ask, and it becomes clear that shareholders are interested in the issue but would prefer a different specific request of the company, the higher resubmission threshold makes it harder to come back with a reformulated ask and put something in front of shareholders that's more likely to be successful. So similarly, this puts more pressure on us in the beginning to sort of come out of the gate with the right thing, the thing that will resonate with investors. The second potential headwind that we have is that the Department of Labor has proposed some very burdensome analytical and documentation requirements for ERISA fiduciaries, those in charge of labor, private, and Taft-Hartley pension plans, in order to vote their proxies. And if adopted, those changes could affect votes cast by plans, or more likely their service providers, such as investment managers and proxy advisors, since most ERISA fiduciaries are not voting their proxies in-house. The clear aim of this proposal is to push fiduciaries to vote with management or just not vote at all. And this rule, if it is adopted, could reduce votes on shareholder proposals going forward, which then, of course, works in tandem with those new higher resubmission thresholds, making them harder to achieve. So I'll talk a little bit about the sort of the pharma-related issues in the 2021 proxy season. Starting with opioids. Opioids have faded somewhat from public awareness given COVID-19 and the movement for racial justice and now the election. But the opioid epidemic has not gone anywhere. The real-time tracking that Donna mentioned, there is evidence of increased non-fatal overdoses and also of increased substance use during the pandemic, which is not surprising given the extent of stressors, not only pandemic related, but also job loss from the COVID recession that we're now in. We also know that big opioid settlements from the big multi-district litigation in Ohio that we've been talking about for the last couple of years are going to come down the pike at some point. They've been delayed beyond, I think, what many people thought, but they will come nonetheless. And those will focus attention on how executives at these companies can be held accountable for their conduct. We've talked a little bit about pushing for compensation arrangements to do that, including the bonus deferral, which Mark mentioned. And so far, the SEC staff has been relatively, has left executive compensation relatively untouched. Mark did mention that our bonus deferral proposal got excluded the first time around on micromanagement grounds, but we are hopeful that our new formulation has addressed those concerns. We've already heard about the COVID topics, which aren't yet in proposal form, so I'll just move on briefly to pricing. You heard a little bit about how we're engaging companies on anti-competitive practices, such as patent abuse that drive up prices. And Tejal talked about how some of these companies are part of the independent chair initiative. If we end up wanting to engage companies directly on these practices, that will be much easier in a Democratic administration. Drug pricing itself has been seen for quite some time as a significant policy issue, meaning that ordinary business exclusion would not apply. But the micromanagement doctrine that has been revitalized by the SEC staff under the Trump administration would likely keep us from doing a proposal that would address specific anti-competitive practices, or even potentially anti-competitive practices in the aggregate. Also, just briefly on independent chair proposals, those are core corporate governance proposals and are unlikely to be affected by which administration is in power. But it is true that last season, Johnson & Johnson challenged an independent chair proposal citing micromanagement. Now, the SEC staff did not agree with that argument and allowed the proposal to go to a vote. But I think that that move signals that companies are pushing the arguments sort of beyond where they previously did, hoping for a sympathetic hearing or a shift in SEC staff views. I think Mark and PJ have talked about most of the initiatives in the fifth bullet, but I just want to say a word on worker safety and health, which PJ talked about. In the past, the SEC staff has considered worker safety and health to be a topic that is excludable on ordinary business grounds. Generally, compensation and workforce issues are excludable unless they raise a significant policy issue, and the staff has not yet agreed that worker health and safety raises significant policy issues. It is possible that the COVID context will change that, and that the SEC staff would take the view that now in this environment, at least maybe at some companies, they may take the view that worker health and safety transcends ordinary business and proposals on it should be voted on by shareholders. So that is a possibility for us going forward as well. So I'll ask to go to the next slide and to hand things over to Meredith.
Hi, John. If you could please go back to slide 20. I'll just want to do a quick note to the folks about, thank you so much. So everyone, there's a few more initiatives, but I will be brief so that we can, we have some great questions in the chat box. There is, for years, the Siegel-Marco, which is a member of the IOPA, they have been filing on adjustments to compensation metrics, and what they've been calling for is the disclosure by companies to note when they've backed out or excluded compliance and legal costs associated with violations of regulations or settlement costs. And initially, as you might recall, years ago, this was excluded and then it was accepted, and companies really pushed back on the direct ask to stop excluding legal and compliance costs. So this resolution has now been changed to ask for the disclosure and the justification for why compliance and legal costs have been excluded from executives' pay calculations, which boost obviously their earnings. So the IOPA is looking for a lead filer and co-filers at Pfizer, and happy to help out on, you know, Beth has been instrumental, and Siegel-Marco do the drafting on that, so nobody would have to do any heavy lifting. Filing on clawback, Kathy Rowan is continued now in her second year for Eli Lilly. Thank you for your leadership, Kathy, on this. We're looking for co-filers at Eli Lilly. This is the last company out of, we have 18 companies that have adopted the clawback, and while Mark noted that companies are not using the clawback, it's important that we have the clawback in place in order to trigger the use of it through the bonus deferral or any other kind of deferral. So these are the sort of suite of compensation tools that have to be in place. So looking for a co-filer there. And then finally, Kathy Rowan is also leading for the IOPA, the asset manager engagement. Shout out to Kathy. She'll be presenting in the spring more information on this as we go through. She led, I think, engagements with around 10 companies last year, having around 7 or 8 investors on each time presenting with the asset managers. And really, we want to a shout out for her support and excellent leadership on this. It is one of the reasons we did so well with those independent votes, and so well on the other votes, even for the early votes on bonus deferral. So we couldn't have really locked in the accomplishments that we have without Kathy's leadership. John, could you please turn to slide 21? Thank you. I realize this is small, but for everyone, this is the IOPA filing spreadsheet for 2021 proxy season. Before I jump into explaining the color coding and the companies, I want to follow up on Michael Price-Jones' points that he was making about some of the distributors, just to let you know that it is likely that we will be calling for a vote against Cardinal's say on pay. That meeting is coming up in the next month. And so please note that when you are looking at your key votes, they just recently put a charge, charged against their revenues of $5 billion. That represents a charge for their expected legal and compliance costs related to opioid settlements, and that wiped out 5 years of their earnings. And at the same time, their CEO received 121% of his bonus for this year. And we would like to do the say on pay vote because we really are, I mean, for all the reasons that are very obvious, but in this particular situation, the idea that the CEO who's currently in place, who just took over the position, had been serving at the company for a very long time and was the head of global pharmaceuticals during the entire opioid crisis. So we really feel this is a perfect storm and would like you all to consider that. So going back to this chart here, we do have a number of companies you'll see on the left that are non-US companies, and so we are not filing at these companies, but this is really just to let you know that where you see yellow area, we're open for potential leads in discussions, and everyone's invited. There blue is the filing for the independent chair request that that Tejal talked about. We're looking for co-filers there. The green is the independent chair. The board risk reports are blue, and they're pretty much finished. My apologies. So green for independent chair, and for the adjustment to the comp metrics, we have identified leads, and again, the green for clawbacks, and looking for co-filers. We're looking for lead filers for all of the incentive deferral, minus a few that Tom McCaney has stepped up to at Johnson & Johnson and Dominique at Walgreens. I'm sorry, and also Tom McKinney has stepped up at Amerisource. Thank you, Tom. So we have lots of opportunities for both lead filers as well as co-filers. So John, could you please go to, I think it would be slide 23 now. I think we're at the tail end. Yes. So now I'm going to open it up for questions, and also to really invite you again to please join us in our work. We've been just so appreciative of the ICCR members who have served not only in supporting the work, but in their leadership, and Meg's contribution and her role on the leadership team for this, as well as Kathy and Donna and others. So there was a question that Frank Sherman had to Beth, and I thought maybe Beth, you could answer it publicly about the impact that the potential DOL rule would have on voting should that come into effect.
Yeah, I think the impact of that rule will depend primarily on how service providers approach their own compliance. ERISA funds are not voting their shares themselves primarily. They either have proxy advisors, or they have investment managers, or both might be involved. So, the ERISA funds holdings themselves are small, and if investment managers and are willing to continue supporting proposals that they supported before, or expand their support to new things, sort of regardless of the DOL rule, and handle those accounts separately, I think that the impact could be minimal. But if that is viewed as impractical, or sort of financially not desirable, and managers want to be able to vote all the accounts sort of together, which some do that now, some don't, then there could be a more significant, it could essentially be a race to the bottom in terms of willingness to support proposals. Thank you.
Tejal, Tim Smith asked if he said that a number of the separation of CEO and chair resolutions actually included reference to an independent chair, and so I wondered if you could address maybe the distinction in the proposals, if there is a distinction.
So the real reason that I even kind of called it out when I was talking was more so in the engagement process, to make sure that when you're talking with companies, you're very clear that you're not just talking about separating the positions, that you're talking about making it separate and independent, because sometimes that can get a little bit lost in translation when you're dealing with multiple encounters with folks. But the proposals themselves, Tim is right. I believe most of those now have a reference to an independent director. It's more so when you're actually engaging with the companies, make sure you're 100% clear on that.
Yeah. And Tejal, I wonder if you could speak to the, and Rhonda, thank you. I know Rhonda Brower's on. Thank you for all of your work that you did many months ago on this issue. So shout out to you. Tejal, I wonder if you could talk about the tipping point for us. You showed really high votes, and what would it mean if we could get over the finish line here and get majority votes? you know, we're so close with some of these companies. Do you think we could take it sector wide, or do you think it would just be really case by the company? You know, how do you view our chances here?
So I've talked about this before when we're in IOPA meetings. I've always viewed the independent chair proposal as sort of the really nuclear option in terms of governance proposals. It is one of the most difficult to pass because you're really looking at the leadership structure. So it's almost as if it's akin to a vote no. It's seen almost as a referendum on the leadership of the company. If you can get it over the finish line, I think it means two things. Obviously, hopefully going forward, they're going to have better oversight of a lot of the regulatory risks. But the second thing I think is that there's a recognition that there are material risks to the way that these companies are doing business. So, getting these fines and the DEA investigations and things like that, it's not just kind of the cost of doing business, that it's actually something that they need to look at and evaluate very carefully. So I think that is sort of how meaningful it would be, I guess, if we could get these over the finish line, because it is a very governance-oriented proposal, and based on our analysis, if you look at things, it can be somewhat mechanical, but at the same time, very case by case, if that makes sense. So like the criteria is very mechanical, but the factors are very, very nuanced. One of the things we've had trouble with is kind of the line between when an investigation is enough to separate it versus, when there's an actual monetary fine attached to it. Our discussion with ISS, Mark seemed to be a little bit more persuaded by the fact that there's actual fines or a high likelihood of fines. So that's good to know, but in some cases kind of depends on how big the investigation is too. So it is a little bit case by case, but we'll see how things go this season. I think that the fact we're in the 40s for a lot of these proposals is a good sign, but we do have to see what kind of happens with some of the litigation that they've got, some of the investigations they've got going on, and then the performance of the companies as well, right? We're dealing with COVID. Pharma is doing pretty well, actually, compared to a lot of other companies, and that is also a factor. So.
Right. Well, John, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you all to all of the speakers today. I want to thank ICCR members for having us be able to do this session, and also for the tens of years of work and pioneering work ICCR members did on with drug companies, on drug pricing issues, on really paving the way for this kind of engagement. And I want to thank my co-lead, Donna Meyer, for all of her vision and her work, and Mark as well, and David, who's always in the background. So with that, I want to thank all the over 50 people who've attended this session today, and please don't feel shy about reaching out to us if you have any questions. We will really be pleased to respond and get back to you. So thanks, John, and thank you, everyone. Have a great night.